The way Sandy had lived her life had been determined by someone for a long time, because someone always imposed their will on her. As a child, it was her parents who made her take dance classes, and now it was her husband Floyd, who was the head of the family and treated her like a servant. And that was despite the fact that they were raising a 6-year-old daughter, Mia. Floyd was a banker and was used to solving problems with the help of power and money. Power and a stable income gave him a sense of permissiveness and control. Truth be told, Sandy's parents forced her to marry Floyd because they saw many benefits in marrying their daughter off to a man who was 10 years older. Nevertheless, their first year of marriage was a fairy tale. Romantic walks around the city at night, dinners at expensive restaurants, and many other little signs of love that made the woman dizzy and want to scream at the top of her lungs with happiness. But after the birth of their daughter, Floyd seemed to have changed completely. He became sullen and irritable, as if Sandy had done something wrong. Refusing to take part in the upbringing of their daughter, Floyd stayed late at work and came home well after midnight. At first, he blamed it all on the heavy workload, but Sandy could feel that her husband wasn't telling her the truth. The longer they lived like that, the more freedom Floyd felt, and eventually, he stopped hiding the fact that he was not being loyal to his wife. Having grown accustomed to power and permissiveness, the banker brought this kind of behavior into his home, turning his wife's life into a living hell. Of course, Sandy tried to ask her parents for help, but they only brushed her off, claiming that they didn't want to get involved in someone else's family. In fact, they were simply afraid of Floyd, who could ruin their lives if he wanted to. So all that was left for Sandy to do was endure her husband's antics and raise her daughter virtually on her own. Mia was growing up as a smart and intelligent girl who loved dancing like her mother. Sometimes, when they were home alone, they turned on the music and slowly waltzed around the room, imagining that they were at a ball from the fairy tale about Cinderella. As time went on, Floyd's nagging became more and more painful to endure. Sandy had repeatedly found women's hair on her husband's jacket. Its color and length made it obvious that it wasn't Sandy's. Floyd didn't even try to come up with an excuse or claim that it was an accident and that he wasn't having an affair. By that time, Mia was already 6 years old and understood everything. The girl felt that her parents would break up soon. Unfortunately, this time the saying, "out of the mouth of babes," turned out to be true. Little Mia was wrong about one thing: the separation wasn't amicable. It was a one-sided decision. Moreover, looking to get rid of his hated wife and daughter, Floyd came up with a very original solution, which truly shocked them with its inhumanity. In order to get them out of his house, the banker bought a small house in such a wilderness that after living their life in a penthouse downtown, Sandy and Mia saw it as a kingdom of sadness and loneliness. Having tricked his wife and daughter to get into his car, the businessman moved them to their new house, which simply shocked them with its appearance. Saying that the house was old would be the understatement of the year. It was built in the 50s and had a chimney leaning to one side, peeling paint on the facade, and windows that hadn't been washed in a very long time. The ungreased hinges of the front door made an awful squeaking sound, and the floorboards seemed to be groaning under every step, as if bending even under the weight of the petite woman. "Mom, is this the house of the forest witch? Like in the tale of Hansel and Gretel?" Mia asked softly. "No, honey, it's our home now. We'll be living here, just the two of us," Sandy said, having a hard time keeping her emotions in check. Basically, Floyd left his wife and daughter without any means of existence. He didn't care the least bit about how they would provide for themselves. The banker simply got into his car, started the engine, and rushed back to the city at full speed. Having a hard time holding back her tears, Sandy looked at the cloud of dust raised by the wheels of Floyd's Ford. It took Sandy and her daughter about a week to bring the house into a somewhat livable condition. Sandy mopped the floors, clearing the cobwebs, and polished the windows to a mere finish. Then she tried to light the fireplace, which immediately filled the room with gray, acrid smoke. Having opened the windows, Sandy tried to get rid of the fetid smog that emerged from the bowels of the fireplace, cracked from old age. "You should call a professional, dear, to look at that fireplace," an elderly neighbor said cautiously. "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. I will certainly do that," Sandy answered, adjusting her hair. The old woman shook her head and beckoned little Mia with her finger to treat her to a candy. Margaret Simmons had been living all alone for 7 years and didn't even hope that someone would eventually move into the house next door. The appearance of the young woman with a child immediately changed the old woman's life for the better. Thanks to Sandy and Mia, Mrs. Simmons began to go out more often and even visit her neighbors. During the long conversations in the kitchen, the women chatted about life and the vicissitudes of fate, which often made life simply unbearable. Mrs. Simmons was a lonely widow who lost her husband and son in a car accident. The old woman had no grandchildren, which was why Mia immediately became the meaning of her life. Mrs. Simmons read books with the girl, told her funny stories, and even taught her how to cook. However, the time when Sandy really needed the old woman's help was when she got a job as a postwoman. Sandy's predecessor moved to another city, so the single mother had the opportunity to get that job. The woman liked her new job from day one. She could make her own schedule. She didn't have to spend her days in a stuffy office, but got to be in the fresh air instead. What could be better? Sandy was very good at her job and soon won over the hearts of all the locals. Letters, parcels, and fresh newspapers. Sandy delivered everything on time. In rare cases, when the notice was especially important, she even handed it to the recipient personally. That was what happened that day. Sandy came to an address she didn't know in order to give the tenant a registered letter from the medical center in New York. Having knocked on the door, Sandy took out a pen and the delivery form for the recipient to sign. Soon, the door opened, and a pleasant young man of about 35, with sad eyes and gray hair at the temples, appeared at the threshold. Sandy saw this man for the first time and didn't know how to address him. She knew his last name from the information indicated by the sender, but not his first name. "Mr. David, you got—" Sandy started saying. "Brian, you can call me Brian. Come inside, I'll make you some tea," the man said quickly. Sandy felt a bit put off for a moment, but then she accepted the invitation and came inside. Despite the fact that the house looked rather neat, the woman immediately realized that it was a bachelor pad. The house clearly lacked a female touch, and Sandy immediately felt it. There were many photographs in Brian's house. They all pictured him taking part in all kinds of competitions and contests. "I've been dancing my entire life, but I had to stop recently because of my back pain. It was caused by an old injury, a compression fracture of the spine. I spent 6 months in a cast. Those were some long months, despair," the man explained, catching Sandy's surprised look. "Wow, I would have never pegged you for a professional dancer." No, you look great, but I'm just lost for words," Sandy said admiringly. Brian smiled back and shook his head. "Doctors say there's a surgery that could help me get rid of all the consequences of the injury. I just received an answer from the New York clinic specializing in injuries of the musculoskeletal system. But there's only a 50% chance for a successful outcome, so I will either get better or remain disabled for the rest of my life," Brian added, grimacing from the discomfort in his lumbar region. The pain in his back was so severe that for the past 3 months, he couldn't even go a day without pain medication. During their conversation, Sandy accidentally mentioned that she used to take dance classes in her youth. Having heard about it, Brian immediately perked up and asked the guest to show him some of her moves. "No, I can't. It was so long ago, I'm completely out of practice," Sandy said, feeling embarrassed. But there was no stopping Brian. Getting annoyed with herself for being unable to keep her mouth shut, Sandy had to overcome her natural timidity and perform an improv dance for the man. The last thing the young woman thought as she was dancing was that her moves would impress Brian. When her performance ended, Brian applauded so sincerely that Sandy couldn't help but blush. "That was amazing, Sandy. You're a natural, so graceful and beautiful. I haven't seen a woman dance so well in a long time," Brian exclaimed. Accustomed to the constant reproaches and mockery of her husband, hearing Brian's praise made Sandy feel all warm and fuzzy. Having said goodbye to Brian, Sandy found herself thinking that she wanted to see him again. The woman didn't know it yet, but that was a fateful meeting which would eventually turn her life upside down. Brian and Sandy didn't even realize when they started seeing each other more and more often, dancing and enjoying each other's company. At the same time, Mia was always with the two of them. The girl jumped for joy at the sight of her mother performing brilliant dances. Sparing no effort or time, Brian started mentoring Sandy, and thanks to his help, the woman had a breakthrough in her dancing career. Suffering from back pain, the former dancer did everything to ensure that Sandy got on the big stage and took part in the country's most prestigious dance competition. It's hard to say when the young people realized that they had actually fallen in love. It was probably at about the time when Brian started using a wheelchair, unable to endure the severe pain. Looking at the handsome, stately man, Sandy couldn't hold back her tears. After all, he was once full of strength and energy, and now he was suffering from pain so severe that his every move looked awkward. "Darling, maybe you should get that surgery after all. What do you have to lose? I don't think the situation can get any worse, even if the treatment doesn't work," Sandy said cautiously. Brian looked at her with eyes full of inexpressible pain and anguish, after which he said, "You're probably right, but I want you to promise me one thing. If the surgery doesn't work, you'll leave me and pursue your dance career. I don't want you to waste your talent taking care of a disabled man until the end of your days." Sandy hugged Brian and asked him to focus on the good. The move to New York took a couple of days. Sandy was by Brian's side during the pre-op, supporting him as best she could. Even little Mia wrote him a letter, instructing him to read it after the surgery. Finally, the long-awaited day had arrived. Despite the fact that Sandy was very anxious, everything went well, and Brian got a chance to return to normal life. Of course, he still had to go through a long physical therapy course, but that couldn't upset the man who'd overcome such a serious illness. Having opened the letter that Mia gave him, Brian couldn't hold back his tears. There was a single phrase written on a piece of paper she tore from a notebook. It read, "Get well, Daddy." Having realized all the importance of what the girl had written, Brian was overwhelmed by a storm of positive emotions. 2 years had passed. During that time, Brian's body recovered completely, and he could firmly stand on his feet. Sandy became a successful dancer and landed several lucrative contracts that turned her into a very wealthy woman. Mia decided to follow in her mother's footsteps and was taking dance classes. The three of them turned into a friendly and loving family, which had no room for lies or deceit. Margaret Simmons often came to visit them, considering Mia her granddaughter. One day, Brian, Mia, and Sandy decided to have a dinner at a restaurant to celebrate their 3rd anniversary. Having ordered a couple of dishes from the menu, Sandy looked up and saw Floyd standing in front of her. He was dressed in a waiter's uniform and looked ingratiatingly into the eyes of the wealthy customers. Of course, Sandy immediately recognized her ex-husband, who had changed beyond recognition during this time. The eyes of the once influential banker read sadness and despair, which was caused by business failures and subsequent bankruptcy. Numerous mistresses and kept women finally ruined Floyd, leaving the man without a cent to his name. Sandy didn't let her face show a single emotion. Instead, she pulled out a $100 bill from her purse and put it between the menu pages before handing the menu back to Floyd. "That's your tip. Enjoy," the woman said in an icy tone and turned her attention to her companion. Floyd just stood there, unable to believe his eyes. Sandy had changed a lot during that time. From an intimidated, provincial young woman, she had turned into a beautiful and confident woman who clearly knew her worth. Having realized what he'd lost, Floyd lowered his head and wandered into the kitchen where another guest's orders was waiting for him. Meanwhile, Sandy, Brian, and Mia enjoyed their delicious dinner and had the best time of their lives.